A person earning $120,000 a year in 2026 can be one emergency away from going broke. Not in theory, in real cities. Take Dallas, Texas, a 32-year-old project manager. Stable job, full-time income, no reckless spending. $2,300 rent, $780 car payment and insurance, $650 health premiums, $900 groceries, $600 student loans, $400 utilities and subscriptions. After everything, $187 left. That's not savings, that's margin for error. And here's the contradiction. This person did everything right. Degree, career, income growth. By every traditional standard, this is success. So why does it feel like survival? Why does nothing accumulate? Why does nothing actually change? In the next few minutes, you're going to see documented patterns, not opinions, that explain why this outcome is no longer rare, but predictable. And once you see the mechanism behind it, you'll realize something most people never do. This isn't about money management. It's about a system where the math quietly stopped working. Most people never question the pattern. They question themselves. They assume the gap they feel comes from something they're doing wrong. Maybe they're not saving enough, not investing early enough, not optimizing their spending. And on the surface, that explanation feels reasonable because it's familiar. It's what every book, every podcast, every piece of financial advice repeats in slightly different forms. Focus on what you can control. Spend less. Earn more. Invest consistently. And for a while, that framework seems to make sense, until you look at the numbers without the story attached. Because the uncomfortable reality is this. If someone earning $120,000 can only keep $187 after fixed costs, then the issue isn't optimization, it's structure. No budgeting strategy meaningfully changes that outcome. No minor adjustment creates real accumulation. At best, it delays pressure. At worst, it creates the illusion that control still exists. And that illusion is powerful. Because as long as the focus stays on behavior, the system itself remains invisible. You keep adjusting, keep improving, keep assuming the breakthrough is personal. When in reality, the pattern you're experiencing is not unique to you. It's consistent, repeatable, and increasingly common across different cities, different professions, different income levels. Which raises a different kind of question. Not, how do I fix this? But, what kind of environment produces this outcome, over and over again, even when people do everything right? The system didn't break. That's the first thing to understand. Because if it had broken, people would have noticed. There would have been a moment, a clear event, something you could point to and say, that's when it stopped working. But that moment doesn't exist. What happened instead was a shift, slow enough to feel like noise, gradual enough to feel normal. Over time, the relationship people relied on quietly changed. There was a period not that long ago when effort and outcome were closely linked. If productivity increased, income followed. If the economy expanded, the benefits spread. That connection created something powerful, predictability. You could plan. You could project forward. You could assume that if you stayed consistent, your position would improve. But that link didn't disappear overnight. It loosened, then stretched, and eventually it stopped holding. Output continued to rise. Companies became more efficient. Technology accelerated everything. Work scaled faster than ever before. But the distribution of that value changed direction. Not visibly. Not in a way that triggered alarm. Just enough that each year felt slightly tighter than the one before. Until decades passed and what used to feel like progress started to feel like maintenance. The system still produces wealth. That hasn't changed. What changed is where that wealth accumulates. And more importantly, who gets access to it. Because once that access shifts, everything else begins to follow. Costs, opportunities, stability, all adjusting around a new center of gravity that most people never see directly, but experience every single month. At some point, the pressure stops feeling random. It starts to feel structured. Not because your expenses are unusual, but because they're predictable. They show up in the same places for almost everyone. Housing, healthcare, education, transportation. Not luxuries, the baseline. And that's where something subtle changed. These weren't always the most expensive parts of life. They became that way, gradually, quietly, until they started consuming a larger share of income than they ever had before. Take housing, not as an investment, just as a place to live. There was a time when a single income could reasonably support it. Not comfortably, but realistically. Now, in many cities, that same cost demands two incomes, and even then it stretches. Not because homes became dramatically better, but because housing stopped behaving like a basic need and started behaving like a financial asset, something to be bought, leveraged, held, and appreciated. And once that shift happens, price is no longer anchored to what people can afford. It's anchored to what capital is willing to pay. The same pattern repeats elsewhere. Healthcare is no longer just care. It's a layered system of pricing, insurance structures, and negotiated rates that few people fully understand, but everyone pays into. Education is no longer just preparation. It's a long-term financial commitment that begins before income even starts. And each of these systems has one thing in common. They scale faster than wages, independently, relentlessly. So even if your income increases, your baseline rises with it, sometimes faster, which creates a strange effect. From the outside, it looks like progress, higher income, better job, more stability. But underneath, the cost of maintaining that position is expanding at the same time, absorbing the difference, until the increase stops feeling like gain and starts feeling like compensation for staying in place. And once that happens, you're no longer building, you're maintaining access to housing, to healthcare, to opportunity. Not moving forward, just paying to not fall behind. At this point, the pattern becomes harder to ignore. Income goes up, but it never feels like enough. Costs rise, but they don't feel optional. And the gap between the two doesn't close. It stretches. The natural assumption is, I need to move faster, earn more, optimize better, work harder. But what if speed isn't the problem? What if the direction is? Because when you look closely, something very specific is happening. The system is still generating value at scale. More output, more efficiency, more total wealth than at any point before. But that value is no longer flowing in the same direction. Wages, the thing most people rely on, are tied to labor markets, and labor markets are constrained by competition, by automation, by the simple fact that there are always more people willing to work than positions that offer leverage. So wage growth slows, stabilizes, becomes predictable. But assets operate under a completely different logic. They respond to capital flows, to interest rates, to liquidity. When money becomes easier to access, when borrowing is cheap, assets absorb that pressure. They rise, not gradually, but compounding. Real estate, stocks, entire sectors that can be owned, leveraged, and scaled. So now you have two systems moving at different speeds, one linear, the other exponential, and the distance between them widens every year, which creates a situation that feels confusing from the inside, because nothing is visibly broken. You're earning, you're paying, you're functioning, but the finish line is moving faster than you can approach it. And eventually the effort required just to maintain position becomes the majority of your output. Not building, not compounding, just sustaining. And once a system reaches that point, it doesn't need you to fail to keep you in place. It only needs you to keep participating. What you're experiencing feels modern, digital, complex, but the underlying pattern is not new. It tends to appear at a very specific stage in the life of a system. Not at the beginning when growth is easy, and not during collapse when everything is obvious, but in between, at the point where expansion slows down, when new territory, new markets, new sources of growth become harder to find. That's when systems change direction, not outward, inward. They stop extracting from the outside and begin extracting from their own participants, not suddenly, not violently, but structurally, through costs, through obligations, through mechanisms that feel normal because they evolve slowly. In earlier systems, this showed up through land. Access to land determined who could produce, who could sustain, who could build. Over time, that access narrowed, ownership concentrated, and the majority shifted from producing independently to working within structures they didn't control. They were still active, still earning, still participating, but the path to ownership to accumulation became increasingly limited. And that's the key distinction. Not whether people were working, but whether their work could translate into something that lasted, something that compounded, something that could be passed on. Because once that link weakens, effort remains, participation continues, but progression slows, then stalls, and eventually stops being the default outcome. The system still functions. In many ways, it becomes more efficient than ever, but the benefits of that efficiency no longer distribute evenly. They concentrate. And for the majority inside the system, life doesn't collapse. It tightens, gradually, until what once felt like upward movement starts to feel like holding position. And holding position starts to require more and more effort over time. At a certain point, this stops being a feeling and becomes a calculation. Because if the system is working the way it's supposed to, then over time, effort should translate into progress. Income should build, assets should accumulate, stability should increase. But when you look at the numbers over the last few decades, that's not what happened. Between the early 1970s and today, productivity continued to rise. The amount of value produced per worker increased steadily. But compensation, the portion of that value returned to workers, barely moved in comparison. The gap between the two didn't stay small, it expanded, significantly. Which means something very simple. More value was created, but a smaller share of it reached the people creating it. That difference didn't disappear, it accumulated somewhere else. At the same time, asset markets followed a completely different trajectory. Over long periods, broad market returns compounded at rates that far exceeded wage growth, not temporarily, consistently, which creates a divergence that compounds on itself. If you own assets, you benefit from that curve. If you rely on wages, you remain tied to the slower one. And over time, those two paths don't just separate, they become different systems. You can see it in distribution. A relatively small percentage of households now hold a disproportionate share of total wealth, while a large portion of the population holds very little in comparison. Not because they stopped working, not because they stopped earning, but because the mechanism that turns income into accumulation no longer functions the way it used to. And once that mechanism weakens, you can increase effort without increasing outcome. You can increase income without increasing security. And eventually, you can follow the same path that once led to stability and arrive somewhere completely different. Once that gap exists between wages and assets, something else begins to form around it. Not as a side effect, but as a mechanism. Because if assets become harder to access through income alone, then the only remaining path is debt. You don't buy a home with savings, you finance it. You don't access education with cash, you borrow against your future. You don't absorb unexpected costs, you distribute them over time with interest. And at first, this feels like access. It feels like opportunity, a way to participate in a system that would otherwise be out of reach. But debt has a very specific property. It pulls future income into the present, which means before you earn tomorrow, a portion of it is already spoken for. Now combine that with a system where costs are rising faster than income and something predictable happens. Your future becomes increasingly committed, not to building, not to investing, but to servicing, payments, obligations, interest. And once that structure is in place, it starts reinforcing itself. Because the more of your income is allocated to past decisions, the less flexibility you have in the present, which increases the likelihood that the next unexpected expense also gets financed. And now the system is no longer just something you're inside of, it's something you're tied to. Meanwhile, on the other side of the same structure, debt behaves differently. For those who already own assets, debt isn't a constraint, it's a tool. They borrow against existing value, often at lower cost, and use that capital to acquire more assets, which then generate more value, which can be leveraged again. So you end up with two parallel experiences of the same mechanism. One side uses debt to maintain access, the other uses debt to expand ownership. And over time, those two paths don't converge. They separate, further, faster, until eventually the system doesn't need to push anyone down. It only needs to let the math run. By the time all of this takes shape, it no longer feels like a system. It feels personal. Because you don't experience macroeconomic shifts, you experience decisions, small ones, daily ones, what to spend, what to delay, what to sacrifice. And over time, those decisions start to feel like the source of the problem. Maybe you chose the wrong career, the wrong city, the wrong timing. Maybe you should have saved more, invested earlier, taken more risks. And that line of thinking feels productive, because it gives you something to fix, something to improve. But here's the part that's easy to miss. Those decisions don't exist in isolation. They exist inside constraints that you didn't create. The cost of where you live isn't entirely your choice. The price of healthcare isn't something you negotiate. The structure of education, the availability of housing, the stability of wages, these are conditions, not variables you control. And yet when the outcome doesn't match expectations, the explanation defaults to you, your discipline, your planning, your behavior, which creates a loop. You adjust, You optimize. You try to improve. But the constraints remain the same, so the outcome doesn't change. And instead of questioning the environment, you question yourself again. That's what makes this system effective. Not just that it extracts, but that it redirects attention, away from structure, towards self-correction. Because as long as you believe the gap is personal, you'll keep trying to solve it at the wrong level. And the system doesn't need to intervene at all. At some point, this stops being just about you. It becomes visible across generations, not in theory, but in outcomes. Your parents, or the generation before you, may have followed a path that looks almost identical. Work, save, buy a home, build stability. But the result they reached feels completely different from where that same path leads today. Not because they worked harder, not because they were more disciplined, but because the conditions were different. The cost of entry was lower, access to ownership was more achievable, and once they entered the system, they benefited from something that's easy to overlook: time aligned with growth. Asset prices rose while their cost basis remained fixed, which means their stability didn't just come from income, it came from appreciation, from being positioned early in a system that expanded around them. Now compare that to someone entering the same system today. The entry point is higher, the margin for error is smaller, and the cost of participation consumes a larger share of income from the beginning, which changes everything. Because when most of your income is required just to enter, there's very little left to accumulate. And without accumulation, there's no compounding. Which creates a tension that's difficult to articulate, because on the surface, it looks like two generations made similar choices and got different results. But underneath, they weren't operating in the same system. One entered during expansion, the other entered after the structure had already shifted. And that difference, quiet as it is, determines almost everything that follows. If you step back far enough, the pattern becomes easier to see, not as isolated problems, but as a structure with consistent outcomes. You have wages that are constrained by competition, by automation, by global supply of labor. At the same time, you have assets that are amplified by capital flows, by financial systems, by policies that support their growth. You have basic needs that are no longer priced only for use, but for ownership, investment, and return. And you have a feedback loop connecting all of it. As assets rise in value, the cost of accessing them increases. As the cost increases, more income is required just to participate. As more income is required, less is available to accumulate. And without accumulation, the ability to move from labor to ownership becomes limited. So the system continues, efficient, functional, expanding in total value, but uneven in how that value is experienced. From the outside, it looks like growth. From the inside, it feels like pressure. And the most important part is this: nothing here requires failure. People can do everything right, make rational decisions, work consistently, follow every piece of accepted advice, and still arrive at the same outcome. Not because they made mistakes, but because the structure produces that result by default. Up to this point, everything you've seen could be explained as a slow shift, something that happened over time, something that might stabilize. But the current trajectory suggests something else: acceleration. Several forces are now moving in the same direction at the same time. Interest rates have risen from near zero to levels not seen in years, which makes borrowing more expensive without meaningfully reducing the cost of assets. At the same time, automation is no longer limited to manual work. It's moving into cognitive roles: analysis, writing, programming, the very positions that were once considered secure, which increases pressure on wages precisely where stability used to come from. Meanwhile, entire industries have become increasingly concentrated: fewer players, more pricing power, which allows costs to rise without direct competition. And layered on top of that, new pressures emerge: insurance costs increasing in certain regions, healthcare demands growing with an aging population. All of these forces don't operate separately, they compound, which means the conditions you're experiencing now are not static, they're evolving. And if the structure remains unchanged, the gap doesn't just persist, it widens. Once you see the pattern, it doesn't disappear. It changes how you interpret everything that comes after. And at that point, the question is no longer what's happening, it's what you do with that understanding. Because realistically, there are only a few paths forward. The first is collective change, restructuring the system itself. Policies that shift the balance between labor and capital, wages, healthcare, housing, education redefined at a structural level. But that requires coordination, scale, and a level of alignment that systems like this rarely allow without pressure. The second is individual adaptation, changing your position relative to the system, reducing exposure, altering cost structures, finding ways to operate outside the most extractive environments. This works for some, but it doesn't change the system. It changes your relationship to it. And the third is acceptance. Not resignation, but clarity. Understanding that the path you were told would lead somewhere may not function the way it once did, and adjusting expectations accordingly. Finding stability not in accumulation, but in awareness. None of these are easy. None of them are clean, but they are real. And once you understand the mechanics behind the system, you stop waiting for it to behave differently.